Hi everyone, and welcome to this Charleston Literary Festival event. Before I start, I'm going to give you all an opportunity to switch off your phones. It's going to take a second. Find it. Is it in the pocket? Is it in the bag? Is it off? Yes? So, I'm delighted to introduce today's session, featuring critic and author Margo Jefferson, in conversation with our very own Dr. Belinda Gergel. Let me start by extending a big thank you to the sponsors of this event, Deborah Kennedy Kennard and William Kennard. Your generosity and commitment to the arts makes events like this possible, so thank you so much. I would also like to give a small shout out to our booksellers, Buxton Books, who are front of house, and the books that we mentioned during this session are available for purchase after the event. So to the event at hand, it is my great pleasure to introduce Margo Jefferson. The winner of a Pulitzer Prize for criticism, Margo Jefferson has served as book and arts critic for Newsweek and the New York Times. Her writing has appeared in, among other publications, Vogue, New York Magazine, The Nation, and Guernica. I'm happy to say that this is Margo Jefferson's second appearance at the Charleston Literary Festival. She visited us in 2018 to discuss her memoir, Negroland. This memoir received the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography. Margo Jefferson is also the author of On Michael Jackson and is a professor of writing at Columbia University School of the Arts. This year, Margo Jefferson received the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize in the category of nonfiction. Welcome, Margo.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's also a great pleasure to welcome our interlocutor for this event, Dr. Belinda Gergel. A professional educator, Dr. Gergel has been a teacher in Richland School District 1 in Columbia, South Carolina, and a faculty member and the chair of the History and Political Department at Columbia College. The author of several works on South Carolina history, Dr. Gergel was co-editor of Matthew J. Perry, The Man, His Times, and His Legacy, a book that chronicles the life and accomplishments of South Carolina's first African-American U.S. District Court judge who led the struggle for desegregation in South Carolina. Active in community and cultural organizations, Dr. Gergel has served on many boards, including the Claflin University Board of Trustees, as president of the Historic Columbia Foundation, the South Carolina Jewish Historical Society, and the Fort Sumter Trust. So, quickly, writing this introduction, I was reminded of one of the first passages in the book that we're here to discuss today, Margo Jefferson's Constructing a Nervous System, where Margo writes, "I keep carping and fussing, rearing up against the words critic and criticism. Such august, temperate words. They make me think Gertrude Stein was right, that nouns are boring, because all they do is name things. And just naming names is all right when you want to call a roll, but is it good for anything else? When you're thrilled by a taffeta petticoat, a flying buttress, a sound chamber of notes and syllables, when an idea makes you feel as if the top of your head were being taken off." Close quote. So now, to move from nouns to ideas, I defer to Dr. Gergel and Margo Jefferson.
Thank you. What a treat to be here on this stage with you.
Thank you.
You know, we never know the impact that we have on people. 4 years ago, I was navigating through the book festival and took my seat on the second row. And Margo, I didn't know about you, okay? But you came in and you sat down, and I was absolutely mesmerized by your presentation on Negroland. It was phenomenal. It opened up things to me that I had never thought about. I pored over the book, gave it as gifts to friends, and so when I was approached about possibly working on the program and the opportunity came up to be with you, I grabbed it. So thank you for being here, and again, a true honor to be with you.
The honor is mutual, and thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
So as we get started,
Yes.
why don't you tell us a little bit about what this book is about?
Yes.
Okay.
I shall. All right. This is my second memoir. Negroland was the first, and what they have in common is I think of them as cultural and temperamental memoirs. In Negroland, I wanted to capture, to both document, honor, and critique a very particular Black world in Chicago, in the first half, largely, of the 20th century, when, in fact, the word Negro capitalized was honorable. I wanted to be the voice, not the official all praises due voice, but the questioning, speculative, some praise due, some praise withheld. I did, in that way, want to be a critic, appreciative and critical of this very particular world with it all. My secular trinity would be race, gender, and class. In terms of the material I work with autobiographically, I would also add to that the arts, since I'm an art critic. So I wanted to explore changes, contradictions, habits, legacies, ugly, honorable, and otherwise. And I wanted to show also how this particular character, me, this temperament, who grew in certain ways, was shaped by that world. So the voice was sometimes very particular and confessional. And from there, I got rather obsessed with how you, in fact, combine a general view that is more historical and sociological and cultural with a very, very particular, individualistic, that part of ourselves that is our personal culture, the secrets of it, the particularities reside. So when I came to writing a second memoir, I decided, it's not going to literally be part two. I'm going to take this need to record the life that I am living in the world that it is being lived. I'm going to take that, and I'm going to take this intense passion for music, literature, dance, etc. And what I'm going to do is somewhat alter the proportions. I want to use the art parts in a very intimate way. I want to use them as if they were, as if this particular dancer was a member of my family. In fact, my sister was a dancer, but as if Ella Fitzgerald had this intense effect on me as my mother. So that was the first thing, to use the arts as very private, intense material that was aesthetic, but it was also emotional. And then I wanted, with the memoir, I wanted to use what we tend to think of as a critic's voice, a voice that can step back, that can analyze, that can even say to its own narrator, Margo, stop, wait a minute, I'm not sure I believe that. Aren't you being a little glib here? The critic assessing and balancing and evaluating this material. So I wanted it to be a book of a number of parts and a number of voices, where the proportions of intimacy and confession and analysis and historicism, where those proportions were mingled and shifted.
And so as I've come to get to know you,
yes.
And we did not meet until lunch today.
It's been a very speedy
process. But I will tell you, I have the distinct advantage because I know all about you.
Well, we writers all withhold something.
No, I've read Negroland, pored over it, and of course I've read this, and you have shared so much about yourself, and I want to get into some of that. But can you take a minute out and tell us a little bit more particularly about your family and this upbringing that you had, and because you're center stage in both of these books. So give us a little bit more.
Yeah.
Tell us about this family that you grew up in.
This particular world that I grew up in, that my family was part of, was very aware of itself as, one could variously call it, a black elite, a black haute bourgeoisie, a black bourgeoisie, but in any case, it was this is a world that has gone back centuries. You know, there have always been, as long as there have been black people in America, these various classes, and they clash with each other despite racial unity, and they have very clear senses of themselves. So I wanted to give dimension and texture to this world with its ambitions, its accomplishments, its snobberies, its mixed heritage. Chicago, among other things, is a very southern and a very northern city. The ways in which it felt itself very much a part of a vast and long black history, and the ways in which it was also, because remember, I'm talking really of the first half of the 20th century, my parents and their parents had fully experienced desegregation, and segregation, forgive me, and in various ways had started this process of tenuous, careful, charged desegregation, which my sister and I, moving into largely white schools and such, we're very involved in. So it was a very self-contained world, clubs and sororities and fraternities, and yet it was also venturing forth, a venturing forth world in terms of integration. And that meant the culture that I received, the cultural messages, the cultural objects, texts, whatever, were wonderfully in many ways, sometimes with complicated pain, like watching Gone with the Wind, but also wonderfully in many ways mixed. My mother would be telling me about Langston Hughes and James Weldon Johnson. My school, the University of Chicago Laboratory School, would be acknowledging that Langston Hughes had taught there, but really, teaching us Huckleberry Finn and Hamlet. My father had longed, though he became a doctor, to play with Duke Ellington's orchestra. So the house was full of that. And yet my classical piano teacher had trained with with Florence Price. So they were part of the black classical world. So it's that.
Was it a privileged life?
Yes, it was. Any upper middle class of any group has certain numbers of privileges, amounts of. It was also, we also understood that privilege could be challenged at just about any point.
At any point.
Yes, it was. They enjoyed themselves, but it was a wary and watchful privilege as well. We were taught, you must represent, the race at its best, so that white people will understand with their equals and sometimes with their superiors. So there was always that virtue and that edge of anger.
Always there.
Yeah, both things.
You were
not every moment.
No, but I mean, it's a theme.
It was yes, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And that's why both books have so much performing in them, because you're performing with your parents, with your grandparents, you're performing at school. You're always both a representative of your race and your sex as a young black girl and woman, and at the same time, you're supposed to be an interesting individual.
Pretty full list.
It is.
So, at what point did you become attracted to writing?
Early on, very
You were a
early.
diary keeper? You kept that?
No, but I wrote a lot of little stories and poems. They weren't deep, but I thought they were deep sometimes. But I loved it. I had a lot of fun with it. Chicago also had a very good Black library system in particular. A wonderful woman named Vivian Harsh who had collected first editions of many Black books. And my mother had worked for her and got one of my poems published in one of her magazines. My school teachers always said, one of them said, in Margo, we have a future poetess. So
and there you are.
But we have to take the ESS off, though, and change it to prose. So I always, in that way, my parents, they had 2 girls, and it's probably easier to encourage girls in the arts still than, say, in the sciences. My father was a doctor, but he didn't say don't, but the real passion was going into, in addition to our doing well in school, my sister wanting to be a dancer, my wanting to be a pianist or a writer.
Okay, and so you're drawn to memoir.
Well, I haven't been. I am now.
I
wasn't until 2015.
Okay. You did all sorts of articles on
I did criticism for years.
And then the Michael Jackson book.
Which was also criticism, but also very much about being drawn in spite of yourself, being fascinated by some figure in the culture that signals, to your secret selves, but also frightens you and scares you. So I wanted to explore those more raw feelings through a cultural analysis of this once upon a time genius and finally deeply troubled and destructive and self-destructive creature.
But you're drawn to it in Negroland, and you decide you're going to do that.
Yes.
And what do you think drew you to that form?
Memoir. I think partly because it had been, on 2 levels, somewhat forbidden. If you are, I'll start with what's easiest, if you are a critic, your opinions always have to be framed with a kind of rationality. It's like, and also with a certain omniscience. I'm the omniscient narrator. This is what I've decided. You are not that I. If you use I in criticism, it's a very contained I. I don't care for this. I care for that. Let me, by the way, remind you how well trained I am in that. So that is one kind of verb. It doesn't encourage you to think I'm going to confess. The other, trickier and more complicated part was that in this particular generation, really the legacy was from the 18th century, 20th century Black bourgeoisie I was growing up in, we were taught to be very careful because everything that any individual Black did in those days, and there was real truth to that was wrong, or that didn't look good, would be held against the whole race. So we needed to be very careful about how we spoke in public about our people, from the family to the race at large, because anything negative could be turned against you. So I had to fight through a certain amount of that to
Well, you did, because you share
memoir.
some things with us that are deeply personal.
It's true. It's true. So actually, the challenges of the forbidden, again, something that at a certain point as a writer, whatever the challenge is, I'm going to be stuck for life if I don't take this on. If that sense of, I don't know how to do this, or I can't do it, or I'm scared to do it, it's very humiliating. So you have to find some way.
So tell us.
Also, my parents and their friends, they were all dying.
Yes.
And they were so compelling and charming, and it broke my heart. I just thought, I've got to start.
So you've left a legacy. I mean, you've gotten their stories out there, and that was
or my versions of their stories. That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Can you tell us? I think it's always interesting to find out how a writer writes. Where do you write? You wake up in the morning, have a cup of coffee and start writing, or what happens?
Not quite. That's very, very generous of you. I wake up, I daydream a little bit. I have a little notebook by my bed. I don't always write in it, but if I wrote something interesting the night before or woke up from a dream, I'll go over that. Then I have the breakfast, and then I sit down at a big writing table, nice surface, in my It's like a tiny little study in the front of my house, and I have all sorts of little sayings and postcards and pictures and images up. And then if I'm working on a short project, an essay or a review, I look over what I've done the day before, and I determine one of two things. One, where I have to go to advance the piece. Two, what feels manageable at that point in the morning and what I can maybe put off and get to in the afternoon. You always have to gauge your energies.
But you spend the day writing.
Most of the day, yeah. If I've done a huge amount of writing all morning and till lunch, then I will do more research, note-taking in the afternoon.
Do you go somewhere for research?
I used to before COVID. Well, for research, I tend to go online, though there is a Columbia Library. Before COVID, I had that nice old habit of going to cafes, with my computer or with a notebook. Haven't been able to do that. But yeah, you keep adjusting. It is in that way. Your writing system is another version of your nervous system. What does it need? If I'm really, really non-energetic, I'll find some piece of music or some other kind of writing, or even a scene from a movie that just gets the neurons working
and it gets
again.
Things going.
Yeah.
Moving into constructing a nervous system. Okay, I'd like to ask you, if you would, to read the first 2 pages of your book, which help us, I think, really get started in this discussion of what this book is grappling with. Okay?
All right.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. I stood in a bright, harsh light. The stage was bare. I extended my arm, flung, hurled it out, pointed an accusatory finger, then turned to an unseen audience and declared, "This is the woman with only one childhood." It was part of the night's dream work, and I was rattled when I woke up, for I'd been addressing myself. My tone was harsh, and my outstretched arm with its accusing finger had the force of that moment in melodrama when the villain, hitherto successful in his schemes to ruin the heroine's life, is revealed, condemned, and readied for punishment. I understood what I had to do. At the end of his stage show, Bill Bojangles Robinson would look up at the lighting booth and shout, "Give me a light, my color." Pause, then blackout. When the light returned, I knew it was time to construct another nervous system. For most of my adult life, I'd felt that to become a person of complex and stirring character, a person, as I put it, of inner consequence, I must break myself into pieces, hammer, saw, chisel away at the unworthy parts, then rebuild. It was laborious, like stone masonry. And on the stone masonry model, the human self says, "Go on," admires itself for saying, "Go on," and proceeds to go on. As I went on, I grew dissatisfied. This edifice was too fixed. I wanted it to become an apparatus of mobile parts, parts that fuse, burst, fracture, cluster, hurtle, and drift. I wanted to hear its continuous thrum. Thrum go the materials of my life, chosen, imposed, inherited, made up. I imagined it as a nervous system, but not the standard biological one. It was an assemblage. My nervous system is my structure of recombinant thoughts, memories, feelings, sensations, and words. Repeat after me. It's time to construct another nervous system.
How many nervous systems have you constructed?
Well, you're asking me about Negroland. Certain things made me realize that though I didn't have that terminology then, that venturing into a new form is always constructing another nervous system. I thought of it in a sense as, let's imagine that you had a mobile structure inside, a mobile sculpture is what I meant to say, inside of yourself. And it could as if you were a sculptor, you could emotionally, psychologically, you could realign this angle, or, add more material, change the substance you were using, add colors. If it really moved, then anything in the outside world that happened might alter its position. So I thought of it as some structure that was permanent, but that, like a piece of art, was always open to remaking, to alterations, to, yeah, exactly.
And so what you're going to do in this reconstruction, you're going to merge memoir with
more
the art
traditional
critic.
memoir with arts writing, and the arts writing is going to be memoir, and the memoir is going to also be criticism, and there are going to be a lot of parts to it, and a lot of, in that way, switch my sculpture metaphor to a choir of voices, and I'm going to have a lot of different voices and tones.
And there are a lot of different voices, and I will tell you that as you read the material that Margo just read, it's like seeing the opening scene of a theatrical performance.
I'm so glad, because that was another adolescent passion. I'm going to be an actress.
Well, I mean, I mentioned to someone, she takes these words and she puts them together, and it's like she's made theater with them. But it's not like reading a play. It is like being in the midst of a play.
That's very interesting.
Okay?
Yeah.
So,
what a good distinction.
The memoir is something I've always been attracted to, and I wanted to share your definition of memoir with our audience.
Oh, you mean from the book?
From the book.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. And, well, anyway, you say that memoir is your present negotiating with your past for a future that you are willing to show up in. That's quite a definition.
Yeah, meant to be a little, yeah.
No, I really like it. And as I read the book, and I will tell you, it's not a long book, but it took me a long time to read it. And let me tell you why.
Please.
I sat there with my iPad, and there are a number of people that I have had some familiarity with that you have mentioned, and then there were lots of people and events that I knew nothing about. So I sat with my iPad, and I'd start Googling, and for example, I did not know of Errol Garner. But
anybody out here, Errol Garner fan? Yeah,
good. And by the way, I see our mayor over here, and we're thrilled to have you here. The mayor loves music and loves it.
There we go.
But I was not familiar with him, and I'm sitting there, and I put that on, and I put on Tenderly. And of course, I recognized the song immediately, but it's beautiful. But it takes a while to really soak up all these wonderful things that you are writing about and mentioning and opening up to us. Last night, Richard and I knew about Nina Simone, but last night, Richard and I put it on right before he fell asleep. But it's a real introduction to some new ways of thinking about things you take for granted many times.
Yeah.
So let's start talking about some of these personalities that you highlight. And I think you begin with Ella Fitzgerald.
And Bud Powell. But it does segue quickly into an obsession with Ella Fitzgerald.
It does.
That's right.
It starts with Bud Powell, and I'd never heard, and here comes Bud, or Bud's coming in, or whatever the song was. But anyway.
In walks Bud.
In walks Bud. But let's move to Ella Fitzgerald, because it's a beautiful way of showing how you're blending the way you grew up with the woman you've become. And you have a great deal of respect for Ella Fitzgerald and her life, but you didn't start off that way.
No.
So share with us this
yes.
evolution of thinking about this
evolution from a somewhat shallow pre-adolescent girl to Ella. All right. I begin by putting an Ella Fitzgerald record when I am about 9 or 10, on the record player, as we used to call them. And I am very obsessed in those days when it comes to women, and very particularly Black women, with impeccable, irreproachable, extraordinary glamour, beauty. You think Lena Horne, you think Diane Carroll, you think Dorothy Dandridge, you think, all the models in Ebony magazine, but, impeccable beauty and glamour was another desirable aim and achievement and pleasure, and also proof, of our worth. And I have a lot of trouble with Ella Fitzgerald. The voice is beautiful. My parents love her. The craft is wonderful. The repertoire, but she's heavy. And I am really having trouble with that because, and this, I am not proud of this at all, obviously. This is partly because, not only is there the middle-class standard for all women of you can be voluptuous, but don't be fat. There is also an association with fat with what I'm thinking of as working-class women. And I am disturbed. That rattles me with Ella Fitzgerald, though, in fact, you look at the old albums, she dresses very nicely. She's, she carries herself well, but, this is bothering me. I don't talk about it to anyone. I keep it to myself. I get older. I change. The world changes. Politics and cultural expansion shattered some of these very narrow concepts. And that's fine. But the other thing about Ella Fitzgerald, she was so often placed in competition, if you will, with Billie Holiday. And Billie Holiday, who is a great singer also, would generally win among critics, among fans, because, the voice was so unusual, but it was partly the tragic destiny of this gorgeous woman. She was sexier than Ella, and it seemed emotionally deeper than Ella. And all of this really began to interest me in terms of women and gender and what you have to compensate for or with, and how the fact again of her weight, and the fact that this shows you how it's a good expose of misogynistic practices. It used to be very embarrassing to see women, ladies, perspire, quote unquote, or sweat in public. And on TV in the 50s, you didn't see it. Maybe you would see it, you didn't see it on mainstream TV. But Ella Fitzgerald did sweat, and she pulled out a white handkerchief like Louis Armstrong did, and she wiped her forehead with it. Again, as I got older and began to really study, and a lot of it had to do with not just music, but with Black feminists and with Black history. This began to become fascinating to me, that I want to make the music so much, so strongly, so passionately. Yes, I will pull out the handkerchief. You will see how hard I'm working, and you might, by the way, notice that the musicians, the men, they're working to keep up with me. That's how good I am. This chapter is really a kind of an account of my transformation through digging into the life of Ella Fitzgerald. As it also turns out, her childhood was every bit as anguished and abused in many ways, being abusive. She wasn't, but they were, as Billie Holiday's. She went to a school for wayward girls in upstate New York. She ran away from home and from an abusive stepfather when she was a child and did Lookout for House of Prostitution. You know, she came up from, she scrambled her way up.
Self-made.
Self-made. There's a wonderful line from Zora Neale Hurston where she says in some letter, "I will wrestle up a future or die trying." And that is what Ella did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And your discussion of her rise in the industry, and particularly with a tisket, a tasket, which is unbelievable.
Well, thank you. But it turned out, a tisket, a tasket. Do any of you know that? It's a nursery rhyme. Yes, you know what it is. I lost my yellow basket. Yes. And it's just so ebullient, and it's with, you know, the great Chick Webb Orchestra. It was, Ella got song credit for it. When asked about it, she just said, it was something we used to play in the orphanage. When you read about Ella in that Home for Wayward Girls, you know, she was locked away, she was beaten. I'm sure the girls did play a tisket, a tasket. But the other thing that's interesting is she was not giving that material away. She wasn't, my interpretation is that a good part of her did not want to make herself vulnerable in that way and to have that material thrown back at her in ways she really could not control. In that way, she couldn't have been more different than Billie Holiday. They both were geniuses. But I found that very moving, actually. And at the end, at the end of one of her great Berlin concerts, she's singing all her riffs on Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, pulling in references to every kind of song, allusions, notes, whatever. And at the very end, she sings, "Sweat Gets in My Eyes." And you go, yes! yes, you triumphed.
And so, picking up with this body theme, I want to move into your discussion of Wilma Rudolph, the fastest woman in the world at her time. Of course, I'd heard about Wilma Rudolph, and I knew she was a runner, but I had not heard about the Tennessee Tiger Bells. Okay?
Oh.
This was new for me.
Yes.
And I certainly had not heard about the great coach, Ed Temple. So can you tell us a little, share, and then let's talk a little bit about bodies.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, the Tennessee Tiger Bells, I wish I could get my dates completely straight, but they cleaned up at the Olympics, at the Pan American Games, gold medals, individual and group in the, was it 56 to 60? It's all in the book. Does anyone know?
I went to Wikipedia.
What? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And they were just extraordinary. They were breaking records, particularly Wilma Rudolph, and they were these young black women, students at Tennessee State, conquering the world, basically. Well, one of the reasons I was so interested was, again, in those days, girls and athletics, that was very tricky. We weren't supposed to take them seriously, but these young women did. Again, there were certain class biases built into that, but my sister and I were mesmerized by them, and they came back to me when I wrote this book, partly because the obsession with women's bodies, and particularly with black women's bodies, as, you know, objects that don't appear to be historically meeting the normal standards of bodies. And oh my goodness, these bodies have been used sexually, and they, you know, this is all in some way associated with the unclean part of women and of blacks and of black women. And I really wanted to think about that and to redeem it in a certain way. So much interesting work has now been done by women scholars and writers on the black female body. We're taking it from all this shame but I wanted to redeem it and look at them again as, in a certain way. I do think of really good athletes as, in their own way, artists. And I was going back to them thrilled. And, you know, they were ways to insert oneself into tales of glory for women and black women. And it also, I combine that in the book with passages on dance, because my sister and I were both taking ballet, which is another...
and I was going to go to that, because you didn't see sports.
At that time,
no, as something you would be drawn to. It wasn't part of that curated life.
Absolutely not. In fact, my sister was a really good runner. And that was fun when she was, she was beating all the boys in school. And that was fun, but this would never have been permitted by my parents or, I think entertained by her seriously as something that she, that would be violating in a certain way the good education she was getting. So there were real proscriptions.
And you do talk about ballet.
Which was another trouble, yes. My sister also, I took ballet, but my sister was a very good ballet dancer at a time when there were few to zero black ballet dancers, male or female. They existed, but they would, perform for maybe a few years in an all-black company. They wouldn't get funding. They would have to go to Europe. But both Denise and I loved ballet. So I used that to examine the ways in which race and prohibition and admiration and longing and a kind of fury commingle and merge when you're involved with, faced with some art form that on a certain level vaults over all of that, and yet you find yourself always pulled back into it. My sister found modern dance, though she continued to love ballet, but that was fortunate. Had she been in a much earlier generation, she probably
wouldn't have happened.
Before modern dance, she would have had to give it all up,
And you finish this chapter section up talking about male performers, black male performers.
Oh, that's earlier on. And my fascination.
And your fascination with them, and especially your fascination with Ike Turner.
Well, now wait, let me just...
Okay.
It's especially, but let me hedge that. There are sections about the performers that I worshipped without ambiguity or ambivalence, like a Nat Cole or a Johnny Hartman. Even in a way, certainly Marvin Gaye before drugs, and for a brief time Sly Stone. But what I found with Ike Turner was that everything that was, when I really thought back on those days when we were children and my sister would play Tina and I'd play Ike, I found, thinking back, and I wanted in this book to examine my relations to maleness and black male performers and the power they had.
And authority.
And the authority, which most women, however talented they were, most black women did not have. Not that I claim it. I'm Duke Ellington, I'm whatever. So I did want to examine that, but Ike Turner, that's my adolescence. That's soul music. And when I played him, even as a child, I got pre-adolescent. Let's say I'm flipping away from Ella Fitzgerald. What I'm finding in Ike is a kind of menace and control, because there he was. He wrote the songs, he set the beat with the guitar, he directed how they did. Menace and control that absolutely fascinated me because it was forbidden. And it seemed entirely out of my range. And he seemed in some demonic way almost godlike. I think in certain ways it was the art version. I was much too timid to get involved with some really scary, the guy from across the tracks. So I think Ike Turner also did that, played that role for me. But I loved their music. And my sister and her friends were better at imitating Tina. So I thought, well, let me see what I can do with Ike. Let me just see.
Wish we had time to see what you did. See what you did.
Yeah.
So,
and this business of being fascinated by, even loving aspects of things that you are also hateful is a very interesting thing to think about. We all experience it.
I'm going to give the audience a chance to pose some questions for you in just a minute. If they don't, I have plenty more I'm going to pose again. But I want to talk about the way you end this book.
Okay.
You talk about grandmother Lillian McClendon Armstrong Saunders Thompson. Isn't it nice though, to have your grandmother's name mentioned again? But
I love it. But there was, let's see, she was a widow once, and then the rest were husbands that she divorced.
Yeah.
And then one died. The last one died. Yeah.
But as you end this book, you're talking about this grandmother that you had and that others have identified within the African American community.
The Black grandmother is a formidable figure.
And
in many
you were
of our
bemoaning, reflecting on those who said, "Oh, she was so tired. She was so tired." Talk a little bit about that.
I was at a feminist meeting, wages for housework and such. And a very nice woman, this would have been in the 70s, stood up and said, "You know, I am so tired. I'm tired for what my grandmother did." And a part of me wanted to say, me too. And then I thought, no, we can't. I got unhappy. I thought to myself, we can't do that. Your grandmothers were tired for what they did. We have a lot more privilege, most of us. So that I kept struggling with, which took me back to my grandmother, who, you know, she immigrated her family went from Mississippi to St. Louis. She came to Chicago. She began as a little country school teacher, moved into politics. Ward politics, ended up owning several buildings. She worked very hard, but she also enjoyed her life very much. But she was formidable. Another version of one should be perfect around the grandmother. And I end the book imagining her saying to me, because she died when I was 9, she used to call me Donkey. And she fondly, and at the end of the book, because it's also very much to do, the book does have to do with my, I shouldn't say struggles, my contentions with depression, melancholy, senses of fatigue and thinking, let me give up. And I imagine my grandmother at the end saying, let me get the line exactly right. If she were alive here with me now, what would she say? I think she'd say quietly and not without tenderness, "You haven't earned your right to be tired yet, have you, Donkey?"
You haven't earned your right
to be tired. So here I am.
Yeah.
Here we are, right?
So, last question, picking up on that. What's next? What are you working on right now?
I'm not tired.
I know you're not.
I'm thinking about a couple of things. The simpler will be, but I would like to do it, a collection of a lot of the pieces I've written over the years. I am also talking with a friend, a very good and dear friend, about writing a book jointly, not in the same voice, but in separate voices, about women in our generation, black and white, she's white, I'm black, about cross-racial friendships, about class negotiations, about what it meant to be, in certain ways, leaving your family life behind and moving to New York in the 70s. So in that way, we're second-generation feminists, but she's a second-generation white feminist, I'm a second-generation black feminist. So we want to get, again, with very different voices, all those complications. And we both had family from St. Louis, living across, right on two sides of the color line, so.
I can't wait. Well, okay. So, questions. I think we've got a time for one or two. Let me just mention while our people with the microphone are sort of moving around. If you have a question, raise your hand. But one of my fellow board members on the Literary Festival, Jim Marino, asked if you might elaborate a little bit more on the Bing Crosby minstrel chapter. Jim, am I putting that in? Okay. He was a little confused about what that big message was. Can you?
You know, the line I'm following actually was, again, it's that being attracted, whether you are a white person attracted to a black minstrel, clown-like figure, or whether maybe you're a black person attracted to something that feels outrageous and not acceptable and loud and bombastic. The minstrel figure is always one who acts out in ways that are exciting but almost repulsive. They do something you want to do and feel you've been brought up to be too good to do. What I got interested in, I felt seemed to have developed that relationship towards Bing Crosby. But what I got interested in was the white minstrel figure as, think of this, Condoleezza Rice and George Bush Jr. She was his brains. You know, he could be kind of feckless, he could be kind of goofy. She once said, I'm channeling his, his personality. I'm channeling him to understand him. Oprah and Dr. Phil, and Oprah first, and then Dr. Oz, whom she has now turned against. I got very interested in this figure of a black woman who could use a white man of considerable power and certain obvious limitations. And she could, in some way, serve him, but also elevate him. And then if she needed to, like Oprah, she could drop him. I liked that reverse, I liked that inverted power dynamic. With Bing Crosby, it was something about, he's my parents' and grandparents' generation. You know, he started off as kind of, I love Louis Armstrong and Dick Spiderback. He was a good singer. Then he became this very benevolent sort of father of gentle America. Then he started playing priests. So he was always then he was Grace Kelly's, cast-off but dashing husband in high society. There was always some role ready for him as America's grand man. The private life, considerably more complicated. He was kind of a bastard. So all of this, again, the license. I think what I write about him is I take on his voice at some point, and I say, I'm Bing Crosby. I'm entitled to everything, and there's nothing that I have to do for it. How could this not be fascinating to me?
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Do we have a question from the audience or a comment? Well, I think we are just about at the magic hour. Let me tell you what we're getting ready to do. Margo's going to head out to the bookstore area, right through that curtain, and she will be available to sign this book. I think Negroland is also out there. And I cannot say thank you enough for being with us this year. It is a terrific book, and I can't wait for the next reconstruction to take place.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What a treat.
Thank you.